Okay, thank you everyone. And then for the Saturday afternoon, and then today we're going to, let me talk about next week. We are going to have a little bit different. I'm post here next week. We are our first time to introduce the Indian philosophy and Hinduism. So basics, Shravan, and I met him in another meetup. He is coming to do an introduction for the Bhagavad Gita. And so that would be a different flavor. So, okay, I expect, you can come here and then try on different philosophy. Okay, we've been in the Buddhism, Chinese philosophy, some Japanese Buddhism for a while, and then let's try a little bit different next week. So, Pin, that would be yours. I give to you, Pin, please.
Well, thank you, Jason. Welcome everyone on a Saturday afternoon. So today we are going to talk about the former Ode of Red Cliff, 前赤壁赋 by Su Shi. It's Su Shi, not sushi. And so former meaning that he actually wrote two pieces. The first one is better known, a little more popular. And they're really two independent pieces as far as content. So today we're just gonna do the former one. And you probably remember, if you were here last week, Jason, with his infinite wisdom, he warned that this was gonna be a very challenging task. And indeed, I realized that he was totally right, because in this one short little piece, there's so many layers of facets. It's like there's historical, there's the literary form, so hopefully I can cover the essentials for all of us to have a somewhat comprehensive appreciation of this piece of writing. And so I'm gonna start by talking a little bit about this particular literary form called fu, which is normally translated into English as ode. And so this the title of this writing is called 赤壁赋, Red Cliff Fu. And then I'm gonna touch on the historical background. If you've read the translation, there's one paragraph that referred to these more ancient figures associated with a famous battle. And this really was, perhaps the most famous battle in Chinese history. So a little background on that, and a little background on personal background of the author himself. And then we're gonna open up. And then we're gonna read. I'm thinking maybe we'll read it both in the English version and also in the original Chinese. And then we'll open up for discussions. So yes, fu. What is fu? Well, fu is an interesting being. It's kind of a hybrid. It's a Chinese literary form combining elements of both poetry and prose. Its verse structure is freer than that of the classical Chinese poem. A classical Chinese poem typically have verses that are fixed in the number of characters per verse. And there can be very strict rules about the tonal pattern of each verse and also the rhyming pattern. So these rules are looser for fu. And as such, fu is more suitable than Chinese poetry for description and exposition writing. So in that sense, it's more akin to prose, but it still imparts a poetic feel because it still has the elements of poetry. So some common elements of the fu form include a mixture of long and short lines, which is distinct from classical Chinese poetry. And it tends to be long and wordy, very elaborate. And it has a mixture of rhyme and prose. There will be passages that's unrhymed and then some passages that are rhymed. And the usage of caesura, I actually learned this English word this week. So it's pauses near the middle of a line of verse. And in the full form, it's often by using the characters she or another character who. And another characteristic is the use of balanced parallel phrases. And I'm going to explain these elements further. So because some of these elements are unique to a language that is monosyllabic and tonal. Monosyllabic meaning each character, or roughly speaking, each word is one syllable. And tonal is that words, there's an extra dimension to the Chinese language. More than just consonants and vowels, each character also has a tone. So this parallel versing is the usage of adjacent verses with one-to-one character correspondences in parts of speech. And sometimes there are rules about opposing tones as well. So let me explain that. The statement itself probably means nothing to you. I've taken a couple of parallel verses from the essay itself. 清风徐来，水波不兴. A word-to-word translation is something like clear wind slowly comes. Water wave not rise. So clear is a match by water. So clear is an adjective. And in the Chinese writing, the water is kind of used as an adjective. It's a descriptor of wave. Wind is a noun, is matched by wave, which is a noun. Slowly is an adverb, is matched by not, which is also an adverb. Come is a verb and matched by rise, which is also a verb. Another one from the essay, 霞飞仙已遨游，抱明月而长终. Clinch flying immortal for carefree journey, embrace bright moon to perpetual ending. So again, you have a pattern that's verb, adjective, verb adjective, a noun, an adverb, and a gerund. And you can find the same pattern in the opposing sentence. So this is a very important literary element in classical Chinese literature. It's hard to appreciate it in English, but when you read it in Chinese, there's a certain, I don't know, it's very hard to describe. It evokes a beauty that's kind of a beauty of symmetry. And it even kind of conjures up some kind of meaning and emotion in the reader's mind that's a little hard to describe. But later, it's kind of a two-edged sword. It's an advantage, but it can also be misused. That you can write a lot of beautifully structured sentences that seem like very profound, but when you actually try to understand it, sometimes in poor writing, it actually kind of just a bunch of nonsense. I guess, in our world, pop music can be kind of like that too. And so I see a lot of actual analogy between composing a full or classical Chinese poem and writing a musical composition. And each character is kind of a note, and each verse is kind of a measure. And then there are these modulators that I'll talk about that modulate the mood of the reading, kind of similar to the modulation in music, like chord progression or tempo. in music. So another device that's unique to this tonal language is tonal arrangement, and then also I'm going to talk about caesura. So there are many tones in the Chinese spoken language, but there are two categories: flat and oblique. Let me give an example. Qing is a flat tone. Qing is an oblique tone. So qing is, if you think of it as music, you hold the note flat as one note. Qing is you start with a high pitch tone and then you drop the pitch. And there's another oblique tone is inflection. You actually go down in pitch and then up. That would be qing. So flat tones tend to induce, when you're reading a piece, flat tones tend to induce a sense of calmness because it involves open breathing, like qing. It's not constricted aspiration. So that actually induces something, I believe, in your neurological system. And oblique tones tend to evoke more intense emotions. And arrangement of tonal patterns when you compose a piece orchestrates the mood of the reader to harmonize it with the mood of the writing. And another technique that's prevalent in the Fu style form of literature is the usage of what we call in Chinese hollow words, 虚字. These are characters that have sound but carry very little meaning. And my belief is that it's pulling their one important function is to modulate the tempo of the reading. So I'll give an example also from this writing. 浩浩乎如平虚玉空. You hear the hu in the middle. That really slows you down. So this hao means vast, vast. It's written twice for emphasis. And notice that it's in the oblique tone. So it induces, so vast is describing the scene, induces a stronger emotion. And then hu, it kind of slows you down a little bit, calms you back down. 如平虚玉空, because what comes is saying that they felt like they were riding on air through space. So it wants you to put in this very free state of mind. So the who is a precursor to that. 而不知其所指，飘飘乎 another who 如遗世独立，羽化而登仙. So this 飘飘乎 is float. Then who again kind of prepares you, and then it says, as though you're abandoning the world and standing on your own. And another passage is 桂棹兮兰桨. So this here is using a different character, 兮. 即空明兮溯流光，渺渺兮予怀，望美人兮天一方. So for the sake of time, I won't go into the explanation of this other verse, but I just wanted to read it out loud. Hopefully it gets across this.
Madeline has a question.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yes, thanks, and thank you, Ken. This is wonderful. I want to go back and redo my whole life so that I become a scholar of ancient Chinese poetry. I have a question about the words she and who. Would these be the equivalent of, say, in English poetry, the convention of putting in the word O as like a capital O sort of slows things down a bit, but doesn't have any particular meaning? Or do they?
I think what you said is the closest counterpart in the English language. It's really, they don't really carry a whole lot of meaning. Kind of, Meaning it's kind of like a last, who is more follows with a segment that with a phrase that describes something that's to bewilderment, like to be something to behold, like so vast, hao hao hu, piao piao hu, you're floating in air. And then she is more follows phrases of emotional things, sorrow, yearning, and things like that.
Okay, so who might be like an expression of awe?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I feel the Xi probably from the southern part of China,
Yeah.
that's the language. Original, I talk about south of Yellow River,
Yeah. Because the founder of that normally attributed to Qu Yuan, and Qu Yuan is from roughly central southern China. Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, and so this leads to why it's so difficult, and why this was part of why this was such a challenging task to explain and translate. So translating classical Chinese poetry and Fu is a multi-dimensional problem. It has meaning, has rhythm, it has breadth, has character arrangement, has tonal arrangement. So I think even a very exceptional translator can probably only faithfully do like maybe one and a half dimensions or something like that, and force the sacrifice of the rest. So understandably, most translations, and this is even true also from translating from classical Chinese into modern spoken-based Chinese. So understandably, most translations, of course, you emphasize meaning and try to blend in, achieve a little bit of some other element at the compromise of other dimensions, leading to a great loss of flavor. I remember my mama used to always say, when the classical writing was translated into modern Chinese, it's like you cook, you follow the recipe, but you left out the salt. And so a brief history of this form. This form developed, actually, this is wrong, sorry. I copied some of this stuff from encyclopedia, but it was during the late Zhou dynasty. So yeah, its origins, as we just mentioned, traced to a very famous poem called Li Sao by Qu Yuan, a very prominent writer that lived in the 4th century BC. And this piece of writing was really represented it was a poem, but it really started taking the shape of what later would become the Fu. And it reached this form reached an achievement height in the Han Dynasty a few hundred years later, with many celebrated masterpieces. And then during the period after that, the 6 Dynasties period, several hundred years, the Fu really became wildly popular, rather dominant, but kind of like a human institution. Just as it became dominant, it also became corrupt. There was this period over time just overwhelmed with overly florid writing with extravagant verbiage, a lot of writing like that with actually very little deep meaning. So as this kind of degradation piled up in the subsequent dynasties, the Tang and Song dynasties, there was a movement in reaction to this to emphasize intellectual content over literary decoration. And out of this movement, there came 8, what we call today the 8 great prose writers of Tang and Song. And they include Han Yu, Liu Zongyuan, Ouyang Xiu, Su Shi, who was Su Shi's father. Su Shi himself, the person who wrote the Ode that we're studying today. Su Che, his older brother, Wang Anshi, and Zheng Gong. And many of these people were very multifaceted, were statesmen and philosophers. And also their thoughts had great influence on Neo-Confucianism later. So a little bit of the historical background so that we can understand some of these references to this battle of historical figures. So this, we have to go back to the year AD 208. It was in very, very late stage of the Han Dynasty. It really only existed basically in name because China had broken into many, many de facto fiefdoms that were fighting each other, or some of them were just trying to survive. In the north, the dominant figure was Prime Minister Cao Cao, or also named Cao Mengde. He was the prime minister, so nominally he served the Han Emperor, but really the Han Emperor was under his thumb. And he was a very competent political leader and good, overall, implemented good governance. He was a very celebrated, even today, poet and prose writer. He was a brilliant general military strategist. His own adversary said that he was reminiscent of Sun Tzu, the ancient author of the Art of War. By that time, he had defeated all of his main adversaries in northern China and conquered all of northern China. And so he started heading south, and without shedding of blood, he took over the very strategic province of Jinzhou, because his power was so mighty, the leader of Jinzhou just surrendered. It turned out, I'll explain later, this was kind of a blessing and actually a bad thing. And so at that point, he took over. Jinzhou was in the middle, basically controlled the middle section of the Yangtze River. So at this point, he was poised with a huge army to just run over the south and clean this up and unite all of China. So that was the situation from the north side. What was going on in the south? Well, the main state in the south that covered southeastern China was the state of Wu. And the ruler was named Sun Quan. He was also a very competent ruler and a very brilliant general. And at that time, there was also another figure, Liu Bei. Liu Bei was formerly a guest general hosted by Jinzhou. And of course, when Jinzhou surrendered to Cao, he had to run away. So basically, he was on the run. He was not in a great shape. So he really needed help. So he sent his very famous right-hand person, Zhuge Liang, to go to Sun Quan to ask for help. And in Sun Quan's court, they were shaking in their boots, facing this 200,000 plus army, pressing down on them. So Sun Quan held a big meeting with his advisors and ministers in his court. Almost all of them said, what the heck are we doing? Oh crap, let's surrender as soon as we can so we can negotiate the most favorable terms. This is not even worth talking about. With the exception of one prominent general under Sun Quan, Zhou Yu, a very young fellow at that time, and another minister named Lu Su, and also the diplomat Zhuge Liang from Liu Bei. They managed to convince Sun Quan that this was worth a fight. So Sun Quan became very resolved. He pulled out his sword, chopped off a corner of the table in front of him, said, "I have decided whoever is argues for surrender will be at this table." So they formed a very hasty alliance with merely 50,000 troops to go against a 200,000 plus army. So what happened? Oh, I don't know why oh, there it is. Well, what happened was, of course, it's a long story, so I'll give you the key points. The northern soldiers, despite their mighty numbers, were untrained and ill-prepared for naval warfare. And remember, they took over Jinzhou without a battle. So they was never tested as far as carrying out a large naval operation on a huge river. And they became sick en masse. Couldn't even walk steady on the ships. And Cao Cao had all the ships chained together to provide stability. And as far as for that purpose, it worked really well. And he was elated. So one night he had all his generals around him, and they were drinking, partying, and he was composing poetry on the spot. And this is when he composed that verse that's cited in this ode about 月明星稀, the bright moon and the sparse stars and the magpies flying south. So basically foreshadowing, they were just gonna glide over the south and take over. And actually one of his ministers advised him, saying that arrogance always led to defeat and they should be really careful. But at that time, he would listen to none of that. So he had all the ships chained together and it was great. So the southern generals saw that and they devised an ingenious fire attack and deception strategy. They had one of their old prominent generals go secretly contact Cao Cao and said that he was gonna defect because this was a losing battle, and he was also, there was an event where they staged an event where the ruler of Wu publicly humiliated this general. So he had, on the surface, perfect reason to defect. And upon his defection, he went on a small group of small boats, and all the boats under cover were loaded with fuel and crossbows that were able to fire off with flames. So these vessels penetrated into the northern formation and ignited large conflagrations and basically burned down all the major ships, and the northern army were either burned or were just running for their lives. So this battle was truly a singular event that changed the course of history. China was bound to be united, but now this battle catalyzed and founded the Three Kingdoms era, which lasted 60 years. In the north, the state of Wei by Cao. In the southeast, the state of Shu. Sorry, I had a typo here. Shu, not Sun. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. That's a Chinese typo, sorry. So in the state of Wu, led by Sun. And in the southwest, the state of Shu, led by Liu Bei. And so it was a period of tense balance between three states. And the Long River, as we call it in Chinese, but in the West is commonly called the Yangtze River, or transliteration is Changjiang, really proved to be a formidable defense barrier throughout Chinese history, even into modern times. with only one exception, which is the short-lived Western Jin dynasty. The mighty armies of the north could not conquer the south, which had naval superiority for 370 years, following the starting with the Three Kingdoms period. So this is a map of the Three Kingdoms era at its height. So you can see really Cao Cao's state of Wei was by far the largest, with Wu and Shu splitting. Southern China, this is the Long River, the Yangtze River, and Shu being, generally speaking, the smallest and the weakest. So, yes, Rubana, yes.
Yeah.
Can you go back to the map, please?
Yes.
So Ping, part of this, so we is the northern kingdom, right?
Yeah.
That tried to attack the southern kingdom, but it failed. But almost half of Shu is part of the on the north of Yangtze. So did they conquer part of Shu? And only the southern part they couldn't conquer?
Shu managed to hold on to this area, and this is a very special area in China. It's a big valley and very, very fertile, one of the main breadbaskets of China. So because of the big mountains, so to the west is basically the Tibetan plateau. And the big mountains and rivers, it's easy to defend, very hard to invade. And also, if you take hold of this area, you have enough food supply to support a fairly sizable state. So this valley throughout Chinese history has been a very, very strategic area. And even during World War II, Japan took over most of China. So the nationalist Chinese government's temporary capital was in Chengdu, right here, same as the state of Shu, and was able to defend it for 8 years until the end of the World War II.
Thanks.
We have an SK here.
Oh, SK, yes.
Yeah, hi there. Hey, could you speak a little bit about the name of that river? Because apparently there's a Western translation only for the edge of the river. And then, or at least, where the trade was happening or whatever. And then the name keeps changing, or something keeps changing along the river or whatever. That's what that one of your links was talking about. Yeah.
So it's not a change over time, it's a geographic difference. So the entire river has always been called Changjiang, the Long River. Oftentimes just called Jiang. When you just only say the river, Jiang, everyone understands this is this river. So being a very long river, its origins in the Tibetan plateau and exhausts into the sea. So different local areas will have their own names for their local section of the Long River. So the Yangtze River comes from the name that really the Chinese only refers to the Shanghai area. So that's called Yangtzejiang. So just this section, kind of an estuary and the downstream section. And the reason why it became popular in English is because, of course, during the Qin dynasty in the 18th and 19th century, when the West first started to encroach into China, they were mainly dealing with the coastal regions. And that's why this name took a hold in the West. And also that's why, the transliteration, the old system, Wade Giles, a lot of the sound are very, you pronounce it in English is very different from Mandarin Chinese. That's because Wade Giles' translation was was mainly based on the Cantonese dialect in China. So yeah, thank you for that question.
Also English only has, like you said, less than 2 dimensions for
Right.
translation, right?
Right.
Thanks.
So biographical background. So now we have to fast forward 900 years from the battle to the Song Dynasty, roughly around the 12th century, and to the figure that wrote the Ode. He's really one of the most popular literary figures in Chinese history, even today. Considered one of the greatest calligraphers in Chinese history. This may sound trivial in Western culture, but really being a great calligrapher in Eastern Asian cultures is a huge, huge deal. Kind of like being Michelangelo or something. So along with his father, his older brother, and himself, they are among the 8 great prose writers from the Tang and Song dynasties. And his writing often assimilated thoughts that combined Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhist philosophies. And his writings had substantial influence later on in Neo-Confucianism. So in Wikipedia, I quote, that Su Shi was a Chinese poet, writer, politician, calligrapher, painter, pharmacologist, and gastronome. And Jason, right before the meeting, reminded me he was also a civil engineer of the Song Dynasty. So obviously, I'm not going to cover, I'm not even knowledgeable of all these different accomplishments. I didn't know he was a pharmacologist. So he really was an archetypal figure of what a literati or a scholar, a Chinese scholar should be in the Chinese popular mind. So a little bit about his life. He was born in AD 1037. He began his early education at age 5 with a Taoist monk. So maybe that explains the Taoist lineage in his thought and writing. And then from age 8 onward, he was entirely educated by his mother. So I especially, brought up this point is, I think in the West, sometimes when people think of the East in ancient times, people just assume that women were not allowed access to education. But this really was not true, at least not true until later times. Things became different in Ming Dynasty and later. But really, when you go back to more than 800 or 900 years ago, obviously, someone like him, a great scholar, was educated and cultivated by his mother. And there were also Song Dynasty, Tang Dynasty, many very celebrated female writers and poets. And at age 19, he earned 2nd place in the highest level, the Jin Shi civil service examination. I mean, this was a huge, huge deal. This was like, earning the Nobel Prize, and maybe even more glorious than that equivalent of today. And that launched his government career. And when you placed at that level, you were considered a direct student of the emperor. And he became a prominent critic and therefore involved in political feuding against the radical reform policies implemented by Prime Minister Wang Anshi, who was also one of the 8 great prose writers. And this got him into a lot of trouble and on the bad side of the emperor. So at the age of 43, the emperor banished him and demoted him to a much lower position in government in southern China. And so he still had an official title, which was common practice at those times with banished officials, but living in great fear. And during that time was also when he began regular practice of Buddhist meditation. So you see these elements of Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism in his own life experience. In AD 1100, age 63, he was pardoned by the emperor and received a promotion. But unfortunately, he died the next year when he was en route to his new assignment. And the Ode was written during his banishment period. So before we go into the reading of the Ode, when I was doing research this past week, I came across actually a couple of paintings by famous Japanese painters of trying to illustrate this party during which Su Shi wrote the Ode. So illustrating the Yangtze River with the cliffs and the boat carrying Su Shi and his friends. And here's another illustration. And also this one includes the full moon, or one night after the full moon, rising above the eastern mountains. And we were fortunate to have a surviving original calligraphy by Su Shi, where he was writing a copy of this ode. And here in his afterword, it's interesting. He said he wrote this ode a year ago, and he held it close to his heart and did not lightly show this to other people. He's only showed it to one or two other people. I think it was the fear that he was living in. He was afraid, he said, and then there's a good friend of his named Qingzhi sent somebody to him to ask for his recent writing and calligraphy. And he said, Qingzhi, his friend, loves me. He must, I trust that he will keep this writing as a deep secret and do not show other people, because he was afraid, presumably, that something in this writing would be interpreted as a political statement and get him into further trouble with the emperor. He didn't want that imperial envoy knocking on his door with a little bottle of poisonous wine, asking him to drink it, which was the usual way that a formerly high-ranked government official eventually receives his death from the emperor. So let me, I guess I have to unshare and then share the translation in the Word document. Sorry, I'm not very good. I'm always slow at manipulating Zoom.
So, when you do this, let me say something about.
Yes, please do.
Yeah, I just like to. I know this one is very difficult. Okay, and really appreciate what Pin said. And then I just want to set up the background before you read the real Pu
Yes.
writing. Okay, I think we can imagine the situation in about 220 CE. Okay, that's the powerful prime minister. Okay, and senior general. Okay, he tried to conquer, unite the China because he's so powerful. Bring 800,000 military experience going down. It's just like in 1 second. Tomorrow morning, I will unite the entire China. But in southern part, they have the two young guys. One is Zhou Yu, only I think 26 years old or something, and Zhuge Liang, that's another young guy, probably about 30. These two persons, they are not the military guy, they are scholar or just like the regular young people you can imagine. They strategize a thing okay, burn out the million military and break China into three kingdoms, and China never unite for 370 years. Okay, if you imagine this situation and that happened, this event happened, okay, at to Su Shi's time, it's about 900 years ago, okay, and Su Shi is on that river, that location, that exact location. He started to think about, his situation, and then 900 years ago, that's something happened here, okay. That's his moment, and he's going to do. So that's I like to summarize. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jason, for tying it all together. Really appreciate it. So I'll read my version of the translation. It's a bit experimental. I tried to preserve a little bit of the parallel versing elements at the sacrifice of English grammar and legibility, I guess. So, okay. 壬戌 autumn. So 壬戌 is the way of marking a year, okay? So it just means this particular year. 壬戌 autumn, 7th moon, one night past full. Master Su with guests floated on board the boat under the red cliffs. Light breeze came slowly, water waves aroused not. Raised the liquor and implored guests to drink. Chanted the bright moon ode, sang the verse of beauty. Shortly after, the moon emerged above the eastern mountain, wandered between the Dipper and Cowboy. Cowboy is, in the West, we call the star Altair. White mist spanned across the river, the waters glistening connected to the sky. Let the reed here refers to the little boat. Let the reed free to reach its destination while crossing 10,000 acres of boundlessness. Vast, vast, as though riding the wind, buoyed by space, and not knowing where it will stop. Float, float, as though abandoning the world to stand alone, morphing into a feathered being and ascend into celestial immortality. Thereupon, the joy of drinking reached its peak. We tapped the gunwale and sang. The cassia oar, oh, the magnolia paddle. Strike the reflected moon, oh, follow the streaming light. Faint, faint, oh, my heart. Gaze at the beautiful person, oh, across the other side of heaven. Among the guests, one played the flute and accompanied the singing. The low, mellifluous sounds seemed resentful or yearning, as though sobbing, as though confiding. Their echoes faded away unbroken like threads, arousing the serpent deep beneath the waves to dance, saddening the widow in her solitary boat to weep. Deeply moved, Master Su sat upright, straightened his robe, and said, "How came it to be so?" The guest replied, "The moon bright, stars sparse, and the black magpies fly south." Is this not a verse by Cao Mengde? Gazing eastward toward Xiakou, gazing westward toward Wuchang. The mountains and river intertwine, dense with luxuriant foliage. Is this not where Mengde was besieged by young Master Zhou? He had just broken, somehow this is an older, not my latest version of the translation. So that's why I'm changing something on the fly. He had just broken Jinzhou. He had just broken the province of Jinzhou and was marshaling downstream toward Jiangling. His craft and vessels extended 1,000 li. His banners and pennants obscured the sky. Pouring a libation over the river, he laid his lance crossways and recited the verse. Firmly, a hero of his times. And where is he now? And of what, let alone you and me, my friend, fishing and collecting wood on the sandbars of the river, accompanying fish and shrimp, befriending elks and deer, sailing a leaf of a boat, raising gourd cups to toast one another. We're merely passing guests between heaven and earth like a mayfly, insignificant like a grain of millet in the vast blue sea. We lament that our lives last but a moment and envy the endlessness of the long river. Hoping to clasp hold of a flying immortal and journey freely, or embrace the bright moon and ending forever. But knowing these cannot suddenly be had, the echoes of my wishes is sent with a sad wind. So I'm gonna pause, and because this old version is distracting me, so I'm gonna open the correct one. I reshare.
I think Madeline have a question.
Yeah, thank you. Go ahead and ask a question. So buys me a little time to
Okay, yeah, I do have a question. I think I'm less confused now than when I read this online. But so it seems that Su is writing about himself in the third person.
yes.
Okay, so this is a narrative about something that he did with his friends. They were out quoting poetry, ancient poetry, plus making some up as they went along, but he's writing about himself in the third person. Thank you. I was so confused. I thought this was like, I thought this was the translator's narrative of what had happened, and he was just inserting a few lines of poetry in it. Okay.
Oh, thank you very much for pointing that out, because I never even realized that could be confusing. I guess it was fairly common in Chinese. It was kind of like polite thing, kind of like Bob Dole. People say he always referred to himself as Bob Dole. It's
Yeah.
it's kind of like that.
I don't know if I would compare the two.
Something like when I write a poem or write something and I say Mr. Pan doing something. So that's the way he do it. The way he do it, Su Zi, that Mr. Su doing this. So.
Yeah, which is a bit strange, but it is natural in Chinese. Yeah, but yeah. So thank you very much for.
And and this is because of I think something we had discussed in the Taoist translation meetup, which is that it's impolite to use first person pronouns.
First person is okay, but it's particularly impolite to use like you. That's considered like too direct and impolite.
I think Chinese culture, they change a lot, but in general, I think if you probably don't see much talking about I, right? The writing hardly say I think, I argue. It's
not much, right?
Too arrogant, so people avoid it.
Okay, continue
Rubana
on.
have a question. Rubana have a question.
Oh, Rubana, yes, please.
My question is, how educated was the public, and did the emperor care to also, I don't know if propaganda is the right word, but to connect or to inform them? Because here in Chicago at the Field Museum, there was a gentleman called Cyrus Tang. He was the richest Chinese in Chicago, and he donated a lot of artifacts, and he paid for a lot of artifacts to be bought from China. And there is a 27-foot scroll called Qingmin. Sorry if I'm pronouncing wrong.
Qingmin. Yeah, Qingmin Sanghetu. Yeah, very famous illustration of society, metropolitan society in the Song Dynasty. Yeah.
Right, it's here in, it's amazing. So my
Yeah.
question is, was those scrolls used to connect with the local people and those who were not part of the royal family, or were they also educated enough or knew enough to understand these poems and things?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I will get to that after the reading. Okay, so if you could stay tuned for five minutes or so.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so let me continue with the reading. So we left off, I'll repeat the last verse where we left off. But knowing these cannot suddenly be had. The echoes of my wishes is sent with a sorrowful wind. Master Su replied, do you also know this about the river and the moon? Those which pass away as such, and yet they are never gone, waxing and waning as they do, and ultimately they do not vanish or grow. If we view from the point of change, then neither heaven nor earth stay for a blink. If we view from the unchanging point, then things and I are all endless. Then what is there to envy? Moreover, between heaven and earth, all things have their belongings. If it is not something of mine, I would not take even a hair. Only the clear breeze over the river and the bright moon between the mountains become sound when they meet our ears, color when they meet our eyes. No prohibition for our taking, and inexhaustible for our use. These are the Creator's endless treasure, and it just happens to be for you and my shared comfort. The guest turned happy and smiled, washed the cups and poured once more. When the morsels and fruits were done, the plates and dishes lay in a mess as a wolf den. We pillowed against each other in the boat, not realizing when the east had begun to lighten. So this is the ode, and I'm gonna read it also in Chinese because I really think there's a lot of musical elements, right? So I'm gonna read it, but just kind of listen. I don't know how it's gonna come across to you. Maybe there's no music at all, but I'm gonna read it. The point is not to understand the Chinese, but just to hear it in Chinese.
Yeah, it's very short, so.
壬戌之秋，7月既望，苏子与客泛舟游于赤壁之下。清风徐来，水波不兴。举酒属客，诵明月之时，歌窈窕之章。少焉月出于东山之上，徘徊于斗牛之间。薄露横江，水光接天。纵一苇之所如，凌万顷之茫然。浩浩乎如凭虚御空，而不知其所止。飘飘乎如遗世独立，羽化而登仙。于是饮酒乐甚，扣舷而歌之。歌曰：桂棹兮兰桨，击以空明兮溯流光。渺渺兮予怀，望美人兮天一方。客有吹洞箫者，以歌而和之。其声污然，如怨如慕，如泣如诉。余音袅袅，不绝如缕。舞幽壑之前教，泣孤舟之离妇。苏子悄然，正襟危坐而问客曰：何为其然也？客曰：月明星稀，乌鹊南飞。此非曹孟德之诗乎？西望夏口，东望武昌，山川相辽，郁乎苍苍。此非孟德之困于周郎者乎？方其破荆州，下江陵，顺流而东也。轴如千里，旌旗蔽空。思九临江，横槊赋诗。故一世之雄也，而今安在哉？况吾与子，渔樵于江渚之上，侣鱼虾而友麋鹿。驾一叶之扁舟，举匏樽以相助。 即浮游于天地，渺沧海之一粟。哀吾生之须臾，羡长江之无穷。挟飞仙遥，有抱明月而长终。知不可乎？奏得托遗响于悲风。苏子曰：客亦之夫，谁与乐乎？逝者如斯，而未尝往也。盈虚者如彼，而足莫消长也。盖将自其变者而观之，则天地曾不能以一瞬；自其不变者而观之，则物与我皆无尽也。而有何羡乎？且夫天地之间，物各有主，苟非吾之所有，虽一毫而莫取。惟江上之清风，与山间之明月，耳得之而为声，目遇之而成色，取之无尽，用之不竭，是造物者之无尽藏也，而吾与子之所共事。客喜而笑，席展耕卓，肴核既尽，杯盘狼藉，相与整介乎周中，不知东方之既败。That's it. So, Rubana's question: how widely were people educated? Of course, everything is relative. I think compared to other parts of the world of the time, one might say it was probably highly widely educated. There were several driving forces. One is the standardized national examination system of at least 3 levels. There are examinations held at the county level, and once you score well on that, you go to the provincial level, and if you score well on that, you get to the national level, as Su Shi had, and then if you place well in that, you immediately get a post in the central government. But even when you score on the lower levels without advancement, you're recognized. That's still really high honor, and you probably get a good job somewhere in government or in other. And so this was great motivation for the populace to study, become literate, become good writers, and advance. Another thing is particularly the Song Dynasty. Militarily, it was probably one of the weakest major dynasties in China, but economically, it was very wealthy. I've read quite a few Western historians claim that Song China was likely the wealthiest nation in human history. Of course, you have to take these claims with a grain of salt. How do you measure that? How do you define that? GDP per capita? What was GDP? And how do you compute the value? So, but I think fair enough to say that it was very wealthy as far as popular wealth. How widespread? Probably, I would say in a town, it was still a fraction of people were literate. And probably if you were literate, because it was a precious enough ability, if you were literate, you could easily get a job in the local county government as a secretary, low-level secretary or something. So you had a good. So I'm just saying, relatively knowledge was widespread, but it was still a fairly rare capability. So Rubana, does that answer your question?
Yes, and these scrolls were used to communicate with the people, or were they just the emperors or the rich people there for their luxury goods for their home?
Okay, so if you're asking about the scroll, I might be wrong, but I believe the scroll was done by court painters, probably for the pleasure of the court and the emperor. I'm not sure it was really meant to be for the public consumption. But things like the writing of the ode would become very popular. Literally, it will quickly spread. A good piece of poetry really was, it was like a hit song today. It would quickly, people would copy it, and Song Dynasty, you know, printing had already been invented, so it would quickly spread across. The populace, even people who were illiterate, would verbally, you know, memorize and recite and enjoy it.
Thanks.
Madeline.
Yes, if we're in the general question period now, I have two
Yes,
questions.
yes.
Okay, they're both big, huge questions. So if you can address either one in part, that would be great. The first one is whether you, Pin, or anyone else here, if there are any parts of this that really stand out to you as being especially Taoist, Neo-Confucianist, or Buddhist. And the other question is, of the things that we see in here, the imagery and some of the phrases, do any of those refer back to things that would have been known sort of popularly or commonly known at the time? Excuse me.
Yes, excellent questions. Actually, that's a great segue. I was thinking, you know, if one of the focus for our discussion, that was kind of the topic. So this piece of writing, you know, when I read the Wikipedia page in Chinese on this writing, it says it represents the embodiment of three religions morphed together. Schools of thought: Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. But to me, when I read it, it's mainly Taoism. I'm a little more hard pressed to find Confucianism in here, except for the one about like everything have their belonging and don't take what doesn't belong to you. Buddhism, you know, it's a little bit hard sometimes to separate Buddhist influence and Taoist influence. I don't see something as uniquely Buddhism in this, but I want to, you know, my knowledge of Buddhism is pretty, you know, ignorant. So I know many of you are much better versed in Buddhism. So I'd love to hear from you. Jason, you had your hand.
Yeah, I have a point here. So the Confucianism, you can see, okay, I read it in Chinese, okay, the Mr. Su said, right? He said, 逝者如斯, okay? He said the time is passing by.
Yes.
Okay? That's very Confucius thinking, okay? When Confucius see when Taoism see the river flowing, he see all the river flow to the ocean. So we should be like the ocean, be big, be vast. But Confucius look at it a different way. Confucius on the bridge, he see the water flowing. His reaction is water flowing. We should work hard. Time pass by. So the Mr. Su, okay, Su Shi is talking about he responds to the guest in the Confucius term, right? So time pass by, okay? We are in a banishment. We achieve nothing, okay? So in Confucius teaching, you have to, as a scholar, you have to, today's Xi Jinping's words, common prosperity. Okay, so you have to be the high ranking and take care of everybody. But he lost the time to doing this. That's in the Confucius part. In the Buddhism part, that part that he talked about from the exchange point, from how to say it? Okay, use moon as an example. Moon from the crescent, okay, to full moon, to disappear, look like it's changed, but itself is not changed. Okay, so you look at the water. The water for 1,000 years is never changed. But if you take a microscope point of view, every moment the water is changing. Okay, so that's all we call it the eclecticism. Okay, these three philosophy all mixed together in the literature. So that's the way I read it. Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much, Jason. Excellent points. I really agree with all of your insights. And I kind of, when I read this, I see it as the guest is really this writing is, my interpretation is about Su Shi's internal struggle. The guest is actually him also, and that's why he wrote himself in the third person. It's really his conversation with himself. And yeah, very insightful. In a way, the guest kind of represents a more rigid, Confucius point of view on life. And as far as reference, yes, Jason pointed out an indirect reference to a quote from Confucius, lamenting the river passing by. But there's some more glaring references, paraphrasing of actually the Autumn Water chapter from Zhuangzi, the Taoist text that we did a month or two ago. Let's see, the one about the grain of millet in the vast blue sea, whereas Zhuangzi was talking about the grain of millet in a grand silo. And there were some other ones as well. Sorry, I'm drawing a little bit of a blank right now because I'm not looking at the Chinese. So anyway, Rubana, you have a question.
My question is, and please forgive me because I am not very familiar with most people with the Chinese philosophy and especially Buddhism. By this time, this is around 1088 or something like that, right?
Yeah.
By this time, the Silk Road had been established for many years, right?
Yeah.
Was foreign influence on the Chinese culture or Chinese poetry, especially coming from the Central Asia, and Rumi and all of them were Hafiz, were in Central Asia. They're from Kazakhstan and all that area. Was there any influence of others versus Confucianism and Taoism in the Chinese poetry, if not culture or religion?
Yes. Okay, so certainly the biggest influence is from India, from Buddhism. In this particular piece, I can identify the Central Asian influence, but in a slightly earlier period in Tang Dynasty, and Tang is most known for its poetry. And Tang Dynasty, actually the emperors were likely part Turkish, and there were Turks serving in government, and some of the famous generals like Gersu Han was really famous general, was a Turk. And also, so there were influence, significant influence of Central Asia cultures on Chinese poetry at that time. There were even poetry that would describe bustling scenes of basically pubs run by Persians and Turks. And so it was, you could tell it was also the important scene of the metropolitan life, urban life in China at the time.
So Madeline has a question. Alex has a question. Okay.
Yes, I'm just wondering, for example, since we have the last screen up, the word pillowed, it does get used as a verb in English, although it's usually used, pillow is usually used as a noun. I'm just wondering if there are other words or phrases in Chinese that that might be quite different if they were literally translated, things that are translated into English verbs that we might usually use as nouns, something like that.
Yeah, great question. In general, in Chinese, it's very common you can use a noun as a verb, especially in classical Chinese.
Yeah, I think every word can be verb, can be noun, can be adjective. So
Yeah. As far as others, I'm still sharing the screen. Things hard to translate. Yeah, that's why I put in all these footnotes. Well, I don't know if I should take the time to go through them, but anyway, let's go to questions. Alex.
Yes, hi. Actually, I think in the beginning we were going through a little bit about Su Shi, biography, but actually I know that he has a very, very interesting life.
Yeah.
Very turbulent, very dramatic, and he didn't. And towards the end of his life, he became more kind of like taking on the attitude of a Taoist, also because of what happened to him. So I actually don't. I know something about his life, but I was wondering if either you or Jason, can elaborate on his life. And also, like one of the most famous dishes in Chinese is the Dongpo Rou, right? It's so can you talk a little bit more about his life and how and of course it's because of his life, what happened to him, that he wrote about this piece, Red Cliff Ode. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think maybe you might know more about his life than I do. I never really studied his life, so please maybe you can share more. I do know that his older brother, the famous Su Shi, also suffered a lot of political oppression, almost lost his life during one of the banishments.
yeah. About Su Shi's life, that's the book about 100 years ago. It's the bestseller in New York Times or something. Okay, from Lin Yutang, the gay genius. Okay, this book talk about the Su Dongpo's life and the poetry and everything. So that's his life can be as a representative of typical idealized Chinese intellectuals' life.
Yeah.
So we can put this way.
And I really liked, he's also a great illustration. If you guys remember when we did the Autumn Water, we read also a preface by Lin Yutang, the person who wrote the book that Jason just showed. He was talking about how even the Confucianist scholar in ancient China is Confucianist during the day and Taoist at night. So this essay, right, it's kind of like that. And really the answer to the guest by Master Su is really, to me, it embodies a lot of Taoist philosophy, that everything's changing, nothing stays constant, but in a sense, everything is forever as well. There's a cycle of nature, and you just flow with it.
Yeah, I think that's what I heard, like one of the biggest like shock to him, to his life, a biggest transition was that my understanding is that during the Song Dynasty, they cannot kill the scholars. It's against the law.
Yeah.
So that's why he experienced a lot when he was experienced in the court and he was attacked by his enemies. He kept being banished. I think more than 5 or 6 times he was banished again to different parts of China. But I think the onset was when he was sent to prison. And during that time, he was, I think, maybe tortured or became very frail, and he had. I think that incident really changed his view on life, and maybe even politics. And you know, during that 100-day period, when he came out, he came out like a different person, even becoming more accepting of life and going, you know, with the flow. And that reflects in his writing. Actually, I have a second question. I don't know if you or Jason can elaborate on the other, because he's such an interesting person and so talented on the aspect of his calligraphy, because I know that his calligraphy is considered one of the most treasured in China, in the entire Chinese history. I don't know if you can talk about that.
I'll say something about it because I actually have calligraphy is one of my passions. So the style that marks his calligraphy, it's also common in the Song Dynasty great calligraphers, is very fluid. And so the Tang Dynasty calligraphy is very disciplined, very great shape and form. And that's why beginners are encouraged normally to start by copying Tang Dynasty calligraphy to really learn the technique really well. So his calligraphy is analogous to his writing. You know, this Fu, strictly speaking, is not a Fu that he wrote. It doesn't stick to a lot of the rules, but it has the flavor of Fu. And that's why he was so brilliant and celebrated. He doesn't stick to forms. He gets the flavor. And same with his calligraphy. If you technically look at his brushstrokes, perhaps it looks weak, but you look at the entire composition, it's like the essence of a little free-flowing intelligentsia, has that very scholarly feel. It's when he writes kaishu, it looks like xinshu. When he writes xinshu, it kind of looks like kaishu. You know, everything is just kind of morphed and blended. He doesn't stick to the rules. He creates, you know, he does whatever is the mood is fitting. So I guess that's, you know.
Yeah, I've seen examples of his writing when, you know, when he's doing court writing, like writing, you know, to the emperor or, you know, in court. And then of course, during the years of his banishment, you know, his calligraphy style would change to much more personal style, more freely. So I think, like you said, you know, if you look at his calligraphy, in his the more personal ones, I think it seems like it's you know, even seem ugly, but it's, if you look at it as a whole, you know, you can see like his personality and how he became, you know, less care about, you know, how people look at him. Like he just want to do like, you know, what he wants to do, be himself.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Thank you very much. Let's go to TC.
Hi, everyone. You know, I've been around for a few weeks, so you know, I think in terms of music. So I had a question regarding what you suggested as the artistry or the musicality, cadence, tone of the ode. My question is this: is the musicality only found in the words themselves, or would the poetry been recited concurrently, say, you know, with the troubadours of medieval times, or, you know, the salons of the French Renaissance? Like, would it have just been recited on its own, or would it have been accompanied by any form of music? You know, they mentioned flute music within the text itself, but I'm curious as to recitation, whether or not it would have been accompanied by music.
Excellent question. Both. So originally there were, if we go back, you know, thousands of years, scholars believe all of it was sung. You sing the poems, you sang the poems, you didn't, you know, read the poems. And they were probably accompanied by instruments. And even in this ode itself, right, they were reciting the the Ode of the Bright Moon and the verse of Beauty, and they said they were striking the gunwale. So basically, they were doing percussion while they were reciting this very ancient poetry. And today we don't do that much, but the older folks, would always tell us, say, oh, when you read Chinese classics, you have to read it out loud and you have to move your head with it. So that's actually how we normally kids make fun of really old people, is sitting there reading and turning your head like this to the rhythm. Yeah.
Aman has a question.
Actually, I wanted to address Alex's question about Su Dongpo. Professor Andrew Wilson has this gushing reviews about Su Dongpo, but I wanted to read just a section that kind of addressed some of his biography about it. It's very short. It says, after Hangzhou, Su Shi's career was a progression of postings to even more remote locales. He was beset by personal tragedy as well, separation from his beloved brother and the death of his young wife. Through it all, Su remained a dedicated public servant, petitioning on behalf of causes like prison reform, local government reform, and better pay for soldiers. Su Shi brought joy to his contemporaries wherever he served. He threw regular parties where his wide circle of friends ate, drank, joked, and shared poetry. A lot of Su's own poetry dealt with homesickness and separation from loved ones, but he also wrote poems about his public works that fairly crackle with enthusiasm, such as the one about the great floating bridge he built in Huzhou in modern Guangdong province. Most literati would never hold office, but they didn't have to if they wanted to emulate Su Shi. He was a model of a well-rounded literatus. Aside from being a public servant, essayist, and poet, he was also a painter, calligrapher, raconteur, gourmand, as well as an expert in agriculture, hydraulics, and even medicine. That's the most concise biography that just hits the bullet points of what he achieved in a lifetime. And his very life biography was sort of a Confucian testimony of serving people. But there was a very Taoist streak that balanced him out and kept him going through, even when the world seemed to take away every sort of carrot he could have been motivated by. So that was all I wanted to share to say to Alex and to everyone. And
Thank you.
It's nice to see everyone. I've only got a short time here today, but I'm glad I.
Thank you, Aman. I think his life is very interesting. It's his contribution to the Chinese society is great. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Aman. Yeah, excellent quotation there.
Yeah, when Su, I think one thing we didn't mention is his relation with his wife. Okay, he also write because he lost his wife when his wife was young, and after 10 years, he's still missing his wife. Okay, so he wrote a very touching point about thinking about his wife. And when he is in Hangzhou, and that's why I told Pin, he also a civil engineer because he built a dike. Okay, that's about almost 3 kilometers long. Okay, and I think it's still here today. Okay,
yeah,
you can see it. Okay, he built it. Okay, so you will see in that time Chinese scholar, when the emperor asked them to lead the army. Okay, he become a general. They have the flood. He become a civil engineer. And then, economically reform, tax, accounting, look like they can do everything, So, that's why for 1,000 years, the Chinese only read Confucius text, and they think if you read in that, then you can do everything you want to do.
Yeah. Thank you, Jason. Yeah, I think right, today you can still go to Hangzhou and see the dike, which I would like to do one day. And there's also lanterns that supposedly was put in during his administration in the.
Or you
in
go
the
to a
lake.
Chinese restaurant to get the dongpo roll. So,
Oh yeah, that I do all the time. Yeah. Jason. Yeah, thank you for bringing up the scholar general. One of the subtexts I think of my presentation is oftentimes throughout Chinese history, great generals were also scholars and writers and poets.
so one thing important here, you see in the background here, that's if you imagine about the 200 CE Common Era, we talk about the war of the Red Cliff. Okay, you can see the situation. You can picture the situation in China at that time. Think about Western Europe in 200 BC. I think the fighting is very different, right? In China at that time already can use a general. Okay, the main strategist is not on horseback. Basics, they are scholars. Okay, so they never know how to use force, use weapon, but they make a strategy and to defend. Okay, almost a million military. Okay, so I think that's the different style in that time. You can imagine the situation there.
Yeah, the shipbuilding was very advanced already at that time in the 3rd century. Huge flagships with multi-level buildings on the ships and specialized ships for different war fighting functions. I don't know, people are interested in the politics of the time of Su Dongpo. That was a very interesting period. It was a time of during one of the most famous reforms in Chinese history by Wang Anshi. He had a lot of very radical ideas and won the trust of the emperor. A lot of the ideas were really, at least on paper, really excellent ideas of redistributing wealth and government loan programs for the peasants and all kinds.
And tax
but the implementation was fraught with all kinds of mishappenings. So it became an ideological war between scholars. With Wang Shi and his people on one side, and very famous Chinese Confucianist scholars on the other side. Many of them great writers, part of the 8 great writers, Ouyang Xiu and the 3 Sus. And Wang Shi himself was also one of the great writers and the Confucianists. And they were engaged in very vehement oppositions. And another prominent figure, anti-reform figure, is
Sima Guang.
Sima Guang, thank you. Yeah, he is a great historian who wrote 资治通鉴, a great history book. So
every Confucian, they were anti-reformation. Yeah. So every time you have a reform, I never see any reform being supported by the scholars. So every time I have a reform, it turns out, people say that's not good. So yeah.
So Wang Shi was a very resolved person. This is a classic case, I think. A bunch of really good people, well-meaning people really care about people at large, but completely opposed in ideology. And Su Shi was, I think, one of the more reasonable ones. What his perspective was, he was prefecture administrator, and he was close to the people. He was local administrator on the local level. He saw a lot of the adverse economic effects. There was a lot of corruption that happened in these huge programs, and distortion and really economical repercussions that were really bad but not anticipated. So anyway, just to give a little more of the background. So it's interesting, you know, on one hand, Su Shi was, you know, if you put him on the political spectrum, perhaps you would put him as more of a conservative. But you put it on the philosophical spectrum, he's more of a Taoist. You know, it just show the complexity of people. Madeline, please.
Yes, on the theme of politics, it seems that, at least to me, that this entire piece could exist without specifically being in reference to the Battle of Red Cliff. In other words, he could have situated it anywhere, by and large. And I'm wondering if he has this specific reference for a reason. Was he trying to send a message to the emperor or to someone about action they were thinking of taking for a battle, or what? Why did he? Did this fit into the politics of the day in some way?
Yeah, that's what he was scared of. That maybe the emperor would read it and say, "This guy is making noise again." You know, that's it. Yes, that's one type of interpretation. For example, near the beginning of the ode, they were singing while they were, you know, striking the gunwales. Something about faint is my heart's desire, and gazing at the beautiful person across the sky. So ancient scholars often interpret the beautiful person to be the emperor. So he was there in banishment, and he had his ideologies on how to improve the society, and he was gazing across the sky, hoping the emperor will favor him again. I don't know, you know, ancient scholars always try to, in my opinion, over-interpret. Like they would take the book of songs and interpret every love song that way. Like every beautiful person is the emperor. It's not a woman or a love interest. So, but it's possible. Yeah. I'll leave it. I say it's an open question.
Yeah, Among have something.
I don't know that this addresses Madeline's question, but you were talking about the conservative, progressive sort of inclinations of Su Shi, and it's funny to me as you look through Chinese history, anytime you see somebody who's a reformer, if they wanted to be at all successful, they generally had to couch their ideas in very conservative terms. They had to appeal to something very traditional. So Sima Qian, I think, was who you mentioned. Sima Qian also. What is her name? The Dong sister. I'm blanking on her name at the moment, but the one who wrote all the rules for Confucian women and then dropped in the little bit about, oh, and by the way, educate them as well, which was a radical and reforming idea. It'll come to me. I can't remember her name at the moment. But yeah, anytime anyone wanted any success at being a reformer, what they really were compelled to do was to couch the idea and make it palatable in a very conservative appeal to tradition, appeal to ancient culture sort of form. And there may be some of that at work in this ode, but I wouldn't want to try and tease it out right up, you know, without years of study.
That's a great point. That's the utility of the ancient sage kings and the Zhou dynasty. You know, whenever you try to reform, you start citing this is really something really old. It's no reform. We're returning to the system of the great sages. Madeline.
Yes, I don't want to hog the question section, but I don't see other people putting their hands up. In the podcast that we listened to, I loved his mentions of technology, like Pin, you mentioned the shipbuilding. the repeating crossbow, which was indeed the machine gun of its time. It was a fearsome weapon, and in fact, in the Crusades in Europe, crossbows were banned for a time because they were regarded as so deadly and unfair. I'm wondering about the what Cao Cao did with the chaining the ships together. I mean, it's what the interpretation that I read was that he thought it would be more stable, people would be less seasick. But it really seems to me as if it's a good way to keep a ship from deciding, like, let's get the hell out of here. We're fighting a losing battle. And that seems like the most obvious interpretation of why someone would chain a bunch of ships together.
That's an excellent point, and there's actually, you're very perceptive. One theory was that he, maybe 80,000 of his troops are newly incorporated from the surrenders of Jinzhou. And those people are not loyal to him, really. They surrendered under coercion. So that is one opinion. I would say a very very mainstream opinion that he really chained those ships together to prevent defection.
Yeah, this story actually, there's a book called The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, and then that's also one of the best book. And I'm thinking about when to introduce this book as a lot of military strategy, political strategy, international strategy, and the historical background. It's very rich book, and so that's the story, they are talking about, So it's very rich in the background. That's why it makes this food difficult.
Yeah, that novel really, I would say, if one wants to understand how Chinese people think, that book is, you need to read that book.
According to legend, right? So if you know the history, Ming Dynasty, 1640 something, okay, and the Qing Dynasty as a barbarian from North China, they entered the Great War and occupied the entire China. And what they read, okay, according to legend, they only read that book, and they know all the strategy and the defeat Ming Dynasty as a barbarian, lower cultural people. Okay, they only learn everything and just from that book. So you can see how rich and how powerful of this book can teach you.
So yeah, you brought up Madeline, the crossbows, repeating crossbow. Yeah, that I forgot to talk about this other very prominent figure in Chinese, both in history and popular culture, is Zhuge Liang, the inventor of the crossbow, another famous scholar, statesman, and military leader and inventor. Zhuge Liang is really the archetype of intelligence and loyalty. When you say, if I say to Jason, "Oh, you're a little Zhuge Liang," that's a great compliment. That's like, wow, you are just really smart.
And according to legend, the Zhuge Liang, okay, invented a bicycle. Okay, so in Taiwan, okay, like my grandpa, we call the bicycle the cart of Zhuge Liang. Okay, so that's the common way to call it, because they believe when they see the bicycle, they say, "Ha, that's according to the legend, that's what Zhuge Liang invented. We just lost it, and then right now we found it." So at least I don't know how about other parts of China, but at least my grandpa, okay, he called bicycle the cart of Zhuge Liang.
He was a famous prose writer as well. Yeah, Alex.
Yeah, when you mentioned the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, do you have a version that you're referring to? Because I'm not very familiar with it, but I heard there are like different versions. Thanks.
Maybe Jason knows. I've only read it in Chinese, so I'm not
You
too
talk about
familiar
English
with.
version, Alex?
Yeah, English version. The Chinese, I think the original Chinese version is not too easy to understand because the way they write is like poetry. I think yeah, maybe the English version. I mean, for the sake of our meeting, since yeah.
Yeah, I have this one. Okay, so that's the Chinese version, and that's the original version. And I will say, well, if they ask me, I will say read the original Chinese version, word by word. And if you have a problem, and read the cartoon book, get a general idea, and then start to read the Chinese version. Yeah, so that's why I talk to Pin, and then I'm thinking is bring this one to general Chinese and non-Chinese. All right, way to do it, because very bad. It's so rich, so powerful, so good, much better than Confucius analog or the Confucius teaching. I think these three books, I think they teach you more. And unfortunately, today's people, including Asian and American, nobody want to read this one. I think that's even more important than Confucius analects, I think.
So would you have an English version in mind right now? Like we can
I feel like too much involved in the original because I read the original so much to the point I would look down at any English version and any Chinese version. So
I'm so sorry, Jason. The version you're talking about, the original version, who wrote it? I mean, can you tell me?
罗贯中, he's from the Ming Dynasty. Yeah, from Ming Dynasty.
Okay.
So I always would recommend the 4 books. That's the Romance of Three Kingdoms, The Journey to the West, and the Red Chamber Dream, and the Golden Vase. Okay, so the pornographic novel. Okay, so this 4 books, I think that's the greatest book. I probably will bring them to my graveyard.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised there's an English translation of Luo Guanzhong's Romance of Three Kingdoms.
They do. Yeah, but I'm not sure. I haven't had the time to read it, but I do thinking about doing this kind of project, and probably somebody want to work with me. We probably make a better translation on that. So
wow.
There's
yeah.
That'll take 50 years. No, but well, anyway, yeah, there are a lot of English translations, but yeah, I haven't looked into any of them. Yeah.
No, but quick question, okay? You said that this, I mean, we're working on this Ode of Battle of Red Cliff, which was written in the Song Dynasty, right? And Luo Guanzhong's version of the Romance of Three Kingdoms came several hundred years after. Yeah. So when Su Shi is referencing about this battle, because this battle also happened several hundred years before him, he must have referenced it from some source, right?
Yeah, the source is so-called the 三国志, okay? So Chen Song, that's another person who wrote for the Three Kingdoms, but it's an orthodoxy history book. So so the book in the Roman Three Kingdoms most are they called romantic book. So basics like Zhuge Liang, there's a person, but probably not that smart. Okay, but today we know the story most from the Romans, not from the historical account.
Okay.
Yeah, the history is well passed down because every time a new Chinese dynasty takes over, one of its most important jobs is write the history of the previous dynasty. So there's continuous recorded history. Yeah, so that's how educated people like Su Shi will have very good knowledge of things that happened, even though it was 900 years ago, before his time.